What the hell happened to you, recruit? You look like somebody put you through a meat grinder and forgot to finish the job. Drill Sergeant Victor Hale's voice hit like a mortar round across the open concrete of Processing Bay 7, Fort Braxton, North Carolina. 6'3", 230 pounds of corn-fed ego wrapped in starched ACUs, Hale stood with his fists planted on his hips and his campaign cover tilted low over his brow. The morning sun hadn't fully cleared the tree line yet, but his shadow already stretched long across the formation of 46 fresh recruits standing at attention on the painted lines. The air smelled like pine resin, diesel exhaust from the idling transport buses, and the particular brand of institutional floor wax that seemed to seep from every surface on every military installation ever built. His cologne cut through it all, something sharp and chemical, the kind you buy at the PX because the label has a fighter jet on it. The recruits were silent, 45 pairs of eyes locked forward, chins up, spines rigid, the way they'd been screamed into holding for the past 40 minutes since stepping off the buses. But now, every single pair of those eyes wanted to drift, wanted to slide sideways toward the figure standing at the end of the third row. The woman was small, 5'4" at most, maybe 125 pounds if her boots were wet. Her hair was shorn close to her scalp, standard regulation, and her BDUs hung on her frame the way they hang on everyone the first day. Too stiff, too new, smelling like plastic and warehouse dust. She was older than the others. Not by decades, but enough. Late 30s, maybe 40, in a sea of 20-year-olds with acne and anxiety. But none of that was what Hale was looking at. It was the scars. They started at her left jawline and ran down her neck, disappearing beneath her collar. Burns. The kind that don't come from a kitchen accident or a curling iron. The kind that come from heat so intense the skin doesn't just blister, it restructures. The tissue was mottled, ridged, a topographic map of something catastrophic. Her left hand, resting at her side in the position of attention, showed more of the same. Smooth patches interspersed with rough textured scarring that covered her knuckles and the back of her wrist. Her right forearm, visible where the sleeve cuff sat, bore a different kind of mark. Thin, precise lines, surgical or shrapnel. It was hard to tell. Hale walked toward her slowly, boots grinding against the concrete with deliberate weight. Each step was theater. He knew how to use space, how to close distance until his presence alone became a weapon. The recruits in the rows she passed stiffened further, if that was possible. One kid in the second row swallowed so hard the sound was audible. Hale stopped 18 inches from her face. "I asked you a question, recruit." She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her eyes, brown, dark, so dark the iris nearly blended with the pupil, stayed locked on a point approximately 3 feet behind his left ear, exactly where they were supposed to be. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Her breathing was invisible. No rise of the chest, no flare of the nostrils. The kind of respiratory control they teach you in environments where breathing too loudly can get your team killed. Hale leaned in. "Oh, we got a tough one. A real warrior." He said the word like it tasted sour. He turned to the formation, arms spread wide, playing to the gallery. "Look at this, people. Scarface here thinks she's seen some action. Probably burned herself on a stove making dinner and figured she'd come play soldier." Laughter. Scattered at first, then louder as it rippled through the ranks. The nervous kind. The kind that tastes like copper in your mouth because you know it's wrong, but you're too scared and too new and too desperate to be invisible to do anything, but follow the loudest voice in the room. But not everyone laughed. At the edge of the processing bay, leaning against a concrete pillar with a clipboard he wasn't reading, stood Master Sergeant Calvin "Cal" Bridger, 59 years old, 4 combat deployments, 2 Purple Hearts he never talked about, a face that looked like it had been carved out of old leather by a sculptor who'd given up halfway through and decided character mattered more than symmetry. He wore his service record in the lines around his eyes, and the way his left knee locked slightly when he shifted weight, a souvenir from an IED on a road outside Fallujah that didn't have a name, on a mission that didn't have a file. Bridger wasn't laughing. He was watching the woman. Specifically, he was watching her hands. When Hale had leaned into her space, close enough that his breath probably hit her face, she hadn't flinched, hadn't swayed, hadn't tensed. That alone was unusual. New recruits flinch. It's biological, it's involuntary. The amygdala fires, the body reacts. except hers didn't. Her weight stayed centered, distributed evenly between both feet, knees with the faintest bend. Her fingers at her sides hadn't curled into fists the way a scared person's do, and they hadn't gone loose the way a passive person's do. They'd stayed in a relaxed neutral, index fingers slightly extended along the seam of her trousers. Bridger had seen that hand position before. Once, at a joint special operations briefing in Djibouti, a woman from an agency he wasn't supposed to name had given a 30-minute presentation on asymmetric threat networks in the Horn of Africa. She'd stood exactly like that. Weight-centered, hands neutral, economy of movement so refined that every gesture, every shift, every turn of the head was deliberate, purposeful, stripped of anything unnecessary. When she'd finished the briefing, a Navy commander had asked her unit affiliation. She'd smiled and said, "That's above your clearance, Commander." Then she'd walked out, and 20 minutes later, 3 Black Hawks had lifted off from the airfield, and no one ever mentioned the briefing again. This woman stood the same way. Bridger felt a cold finger trace its way down his spine. Hale was still performing. He'd circled back around to stand in front of her, hands clasped behind his back now, chin jutted forward. "What's your MOS, recruit? Wait, let me guess. You signed up for admin. Gonna push papers and tell your friends you served." He grinned, and the grin was ugly, not because of his features, but because of what it carried. Contempt. The cheap, performative kind that small men wear like armor. "68 whiskey, drill sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, not soft. Quiet. There's a difference. Soft is weak, tentative. Quiet is controlled. Quiet is the volume setting of someone who has never needed to raise their voice because the things they say carry weight without amplification. Combat medic. Hale's eyebrows went up in exaggerated surprise. "A combat medic? You?" He looked her up and down with theatrical slowness. "Sweetheart, you look like you need a medic, not like you are one. What happened? You fail out of nursing school and figured you'd come here for the participation trophy." More laughter. Louder now. A couple of recruits in the front row were grinning openly, relieved that the spotlight was on someone else, that the beast was feeding on another target. A recruit 2 spots down from the woman, a big kid, maybe 21, corn-fed and confident, the kind who peaked in high school football and was chasing a new identity, snorted audibly. "She probably got those scars from a tanning bed." Hale pointed at him. "Now that's funny. See, recruit? That's the kind of initiative I like." He turned back to the woman. "You hearing this? Even the new meat knows you don't belong here." The woman's eyes never moved. Her breathing stayed invisible. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. But something shifted. Bridger saw it from 20 feet away, and his hand tightened on the clipboard until the metal clip bit into his palm. It wasn't something she did. It was something she stopped doing. A layer of performance, the rigid, slightly awkward posture of a new recruit, fell away for just a fraction of a second, and what was underneath was something entirely different. The set of her shoulders changed by millimeters. Her center of gravity dropped almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, still locked forward, went flat. Not angry, not emotional. Flat. The way a scope reticle is flat. The way a targeting system is flat. Then it was gone. She rebuilt the recruit posture around herself like putting on a coat, but Bridger had seen it. His mouth went dry. He pulled out his phone, stepped behind the pillar, and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. It rang twice. "Bridger," said the voice on the other end. No greeting, no warmth, just recognition. "I need you to run a face for me. Female, late 30s, extensive burn scarring on left side of neck and jaw, left hand, right forearm surgical scarring. She's standing in my processing bay right now with a 68 whiskey MOS on her intake form." Silence on the line. Then, "Describe the burn pattern. Thermal, high intensity, consistent with accelerant exposure or a vehicle-borne IED at close range." Bridger's blood went cold. "Yeah. Hold." The line went quiet. Bridger could hear the distant sound of keystrokes. Then nothing. Then more keystrokes. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The voice came back, and this time it was different. Lower. Careful. The way people speak when they've just read something they wish they hadn't. "Cal, listen to me very carefully. Are you listening? Yeah. You need to get whoever is running that processing bay to stand down. Right now. Do not let anyone touch that woman. Do not let anyone raise their voice at her again. I'm making a call. Base commander is going to get a visit in the next 15 minutes. Who is she? Another pause. I can't tell you that on this line. What I can tell you is that her file has a red border. You understand what that means? Bridger understood. Red bordered files were personnel jackets that existed in a parallel system, outside the normal chain of command, outside normal classification hierarchies. They were maintained by agencies and offices that didn't appear on any organizational chart. He'd seen exactly 2 red-bordered files in his entire career, and both times he'd been told to forget he'd seen them. Cal, are you still there? Yeah. Get your base commander, now. The line went dead. Bridger slid the phone back into his pocket and stepped out from behind the pillar. In the processing bay, the situation had escalated. Hale had moved past verbal humiliation and was now standing directly in front of the woman, finger extended toward her face, close enough to almost touch the scarred tissue along her jaw. You think those scars make you special? You think you've got some kind of story that matters here? Let me tell you something, recruit. In my bay, your past doesn't exist. Your story doesn't exist. You are nothing until I decide you're something. And right now, looking at you, I'm deciding you're nothing. The woman's eyes finally moved. They shifted, slowly, precisely, and locked onto Hale's. The movement was so controlled it was almost mechanical. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, a persistent electrical hum that seemed to grow louder in the silence between his words and whatever was about to come next. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. But Hale saw something in those eyes that made him stop. Just for a heartbeat, the briefest hesitation, the tiniest crack in the performance. Because deep in the brainstem, in the ancient reptilian architecture of the human nervous system, there is a mechanism that recognizes predators. It doesn't need rank insignia or service records or classified files. It operates on something older than language, older than civilization. It reads the eyes, the stillness, the absence of fear, and it sends a single, screaming signal to the conscious mind. Danger. Hale blinked. Then he covered it with more volume, more aggression, the way men like him always do. Something to say, recruit. Speak up. No, drill sergeant, she said. Same quiet voice, same perfect calm. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they were better than you, hit that like button and subscribe right now. You won't believe what happens next. The door at the north end of the processing bay opened. Every head turned, even Hale's. Colonel Marcus Devereaux, base commander of Fort Braxton, walked in. He was not a man who walked into processing bays. He was not a man who walked anywhere without purpose. Behind him was a woman in a dark civilian suit, no insignia, no ID badge visible, and a man in army dress greens with stars on his shoulders, a brigadier general, visiting, unannounced. The formation snapped to attention with a unified crack of boot heels. Hale straightened, his face flushing. A base commander in his processing bay was either very good or very bad, and the look on Devereaux's face made it abundantly clear which category this fell into. Devereaux walked past the formation without acknowledging it, past Hale without a glance, past the rows of wide-eyed recruits who had never seen a full bird colonel up close, let alone walking with a general. He stopped in front of the woman with the scars. The silence in the bay was absolute, the kind of silence that has texture, that presses against your eardrums, that makes the hum of the fluorescent lights sound like a scream. Devereaux looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned in and whispered something. 2 words. Nobody else heard them. Not Hale, standing 6 feet away with the blood draining from his face. Not the recruits, frozen in formation like statues. Not even the brigadier general who stood a respectful 3 paces behind Devereaux, with his hands folded, and his expression locked in the careful neutrality of a man who already knew everything. But Master Sergeant Bridger, who had moved closer, who was watching with the focused intensity of 38 years of pattern recognition, read Devereaux's lips. Pale horse. Bridger's knees almost buckled. Pale horse. The call sign that had become a ghost story in special operations circles. The operative who had single-handedly held a position in a collapsing safe house outside Mosul for 11 hours, while a 6-person extraction team fought through 3 ambushes to reach her. The medic who had performed battlefield surgery on herself, after taking shrapnel from a VBIED, then carried a wounded intelligence officer 2 kilometers through hostile territory to a helicopter landing zone, arriving with a pulse rate of 62, The shadow who had been inserted into denied territory so many times that her operational history read like a tour of every war zone the United States had fought in or near for the last 15 years. Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. Places that never made the news because the operations that happened there were never supposed to exist. The burn scars on her neck, the VBI'd, Mosul. Bridger suddenly understood everything. She wasn't here for boot camp. She was here because someone very high up the chain, had placed her here, embedded her. Whether it was an assessment, an investigation, a training evaluation, or something darker that Bridger would never have clearance to know, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Drill Sergeant Victor Hale, with his cheap cologne and his loud mouth, and his desperate need to be the biggest man in every room, had spent the last 40 minutes publicly humiliating someone whose classified service record could fill a vault. Devereaux stepped back from the woman. He didn't salute her, not in front of the formation, not in a way that would break whatever cover she was operating under, but the respect in his posture was unmistakable. The slight incline of his head, the half-step backward, yielding space, the way his hands stayed at his sides, open, non-threatening, the body language of a man acknowledging someone whose authority existed in a dimension he could sense but not fully access. Then Devereaux turned around. He looked at Hale. The colonel's expression was not anger. It was worse. It was the cold, clinical assessment of a surgeon looking at a tumor. A calculation was being made behind those eyes. Not if, but how much. Drill Sergeant Hale. Sir. Hale's voice had changed. The boom was gone. What came out was thin, reedy. The voice of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is made of glass and something vast and dark is moving underneath it. Step into my office immediately. Sir, I have a formation to... Immediately, Drill Sergeant. The word landed like a judge's gavel. Hale swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly. He looked around the bay one more time, searching for something. Context, support, an exit that didn't exist. The recruits who had laughed at his jokes minutes ago wouldn't meet his eyes. The big kid who'd made the tanning bed crack was staring at his own boots like they contained the secrets of the universe. Hale walked toward the door. His steps were uneven now, the confidence stripped out of his gait the way bark is stripped from a tree in a storm. When he passed Bridger, the master sergeant saw it, the sweat on his upper lip, the slight tremor in his hands, the pale wash of fear replacing the ruddy flush of authority. The door closed behind him. Devereaux turned to the brigadier general. A silent exchange passed between them. A nod, a glance, the kind of communication that happens between people who operate in spaces where words are liabilities. The general stepped forward and addressed the formation. At ease. Processing will resume in 30 minutes. Master Sergeant Bridger will oversee. The formation broke into an uneasy parade rest. Murmurs began immediately. Confused, electric. The buzzing of people who know they've witnessed something significant, but don't have the vocabulary to describe it. Bridger moved to the front of the bay. As he passed the woman, he paused. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He simply inclined his head, the same gesture Devereaux had used, and kept walking. She watched him go. The faintest trace of something crossed her face. Not a smile, something older, deeper. Recognition. The acknowledgement of one soldier by another across the invisible lines of rank and classification, and the 1,000 walls the military builds between what is known and what is done. 10 minutes later, the bay was nearly empty. Recruits had been directed to temporary holding in the chow hall. Bridger was organizing paperwork. The brigadier general had disappeared with Devereaux. The civilian woman in the dark suit was speaking quietly into a phone near the exit. The scarred woman stood alone in the center of the processing bay. She looked down at her hands. The scarred left hand, the surgical lines on the right forearm. She turned them over slowly, studying them the way a cartographer studies a map of a country they've crossed on foot. Each mark a coordinate, each ridge a story. The VBI'd outside Mosul, the compound breach in Aleppo, the night extraction in Aden that went wrong in every way a mission can go wrong, and somehow still produced a living operative at the end of it. The surgeries, 7 of them, at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where doctors rebuilt what they could and marveled at her pain tolerance, not knowing that the pain of the scalpel was nothing compared to the pain of lying in the burning wreckage of an armored vehicle, conscious counting seconds. waiting for the ammunition to cook off, knowing that the intelligence she'd memorized could not die with her. It hadn't. She hadn't. And now she was standing in a boot camp processing bay, being called sweetheart by a man whose most dangerous mission had been navigating the Pentagon parking lot during construction season. She breathed in for 4 counts, held for 4, released for 4. Then she picked up her intake folder from the bench where she'd left it. Inside, beneath the standard forms and medical questionnaires, was a single sheet of paper in a sealed plastic sleeve. The paper was blank except for a string of alphanumeric characters and a stamp in red ink, compartmented, director-level access only. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. One message, encrypted, from a sender identified only by a 7-digit number. Pale Horse. Phase 1 complete. Asset integration confirmed. Tower 4 sends regards. Maintain cover. Further tasking to follow. Briefing at 0400, Building 7. She read it once, committed it to memory, and deleted it. The phone went back in her pocket. Outside, the sun had fully risen. The pine trees along the perimeter road cast long shadows across the parade ground. Somewhere in the distance, a cadence was being called. A new formation, a new group of recruits learning the first painful lesson of military life, that you are not special, that you are not unique, that you are one of many. But she was not one of many. She was one of very, very few. And the men and women who knew her call sign, who had seen the red-bordered file, who had sat in rooms where her operations were discussed in past tense because speaking about them in present tense was a security violation, they understood what it cost to become Pale Horse. It cost everything. She walked out of the processing bay and into the sunlight. Her boots crunched on gravel as she made her way toward Building 7, toward the next mission, the next insertion, the next room full of people who would see the scars and the small frame and the quiet voice, and make assumptions that would shatter the moment the truth emerged. Somewhere behind her, in a colonel's office with the door closed, Drill Sergeant Victor Hale was learning the most important lesson of his military career. Not from a manual, not from a regulation, not from a training exercise. From the look in Colonel Devereaux's eyes when he said the words that would end Hale's trajectory forever. Do you have any idea who you were talking to? And the answer, the honest answer, the answer that Hale would carry with him for the rest of his career and into the quiet, diminished years that followed, was no. He had no idea. He had looked at the scars and the small frame and the silence and seen weakness, because weakness was the only thing he had the capacity to recognize. Strength, the real kind. The kind that is forged in fire and baptized in blood and carried silently through the rest of a life, was invisible to him. It always had been. And somewhere on a gravel path, walking toward a building that didn't appear on any base directory, a woman with burned scars and steady hands, and a classified call sign that made generals whisper, was already thinking about the next mission. Not because she wanted to, because the world needed Pale Horse, and Pale Horse always answered. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Beyond the Rank for more.